You are here, in the middle of a domino effect. One that started years ago, and one that shows no sign of stopping. A bombshell story said UFOs are real. A whistleblower said the government knows. The military has encountered them every day. For years, there are videos and photos. Insiders say off-world vehicles. Congress says we need to know more about the UFO. A task force created to figure it out. Are they aliens? Is there doubt? A report's released saying maybe it's real. The information comes with an official seal. A UFO office without delusions will look to the skies and find conclusions. The government seems ready for the long haul, and on the dominoes fall.
I will tell you unequivocally that there is very compelling evidence that we may not be alone.
This all seems like it's heading towards an ultimate truth no longer ignored. A revelation, for better or worse, will further define the universe. But the story was too good to be true. The story was wrong. And instead of being closer to the truth, we probably couldn't be further away. For those of you unfamiliar with the current UFO story and the cast of characters within, here's a quick primer based on information that was originally reported. In 2007, at the behest of Senator Harry Reid, the Pentagon, via the Defense Intelligence Agency, created a UFO program called the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, or ATIP. The first director of ATIP was a person whose name wasn't reported and who remained unknown. The next director of ATIP was Luis Elizondo, a counterintelligence official at the Pentagon who by now has become the face of the whole story. ATIP was funded with $22 million. The Pentagon awarded the $22 million to Bigelow Aerospace Advanced Space Studies, or BASS. BASS was contracted to perform ATIP's UFO research and investigation. BASS was founded by millionaire and longtime Harry Reid financial supporter Robert Bigelow. Bigelow's been hunting UFOs his whole life. Within the BASS team was Hal Puthoff, a former member of the Church of Scientology who claims to be a psychic who can predict the future. During the Cold War, Puthoff was involved in the CIA's Project Stargate, which attempted to create psychic spies that could use paranormal powers to fight the Russians. Stargate was shut down after not achieving this goal. The rest of the BASS team was largely unknown. ATIP investigated UFOs for 5 years, from 2007 to 2012. In 2012, the Pentagon pulled the program's funding and shut it down, saying it was determined that there were other, higher priority issues that merited funding. Despite losing funding, Luis Elizondo claimed he kept ATIP going for years after this, staying on as the program's director. On October 4th, 2017, Elizondo resigned from his job at the Pentagon, frustrated that UFOs were not taken seriously by military leaders at the Department of Defense. Immediately after his resignation, Elizondo, Hal Puthoff, and others took the ATIP UFO story to former Blink-182 rock star Tom DeLonge and his To the Stars Academy, or TTSA, a for-profit science and entertainment company. On October 11th, TTSA held a press event featuring Tom DeLonge, Lou Elizondo, Hal Puthoff, and other former government officials who claimed to have new revelations about UFOs. DeLonge introduced Elizondo to the world for the first time.
My name is Lou Elizondo. For nearly the last decade, I ran a sensitive aerospace threat identification program focusing on unidentified aerial technologies. It was in this position I learned that the phenomena is indeed real.
In addition to revealing Elizondo and the Pentagon UFO program, DeLonge also announced that he was going to
Build an exotic craft with an energy source that can revolutionize the world.
Build his own UFO. Another presentation by former DoD official Chris Mellon revealed a shocking new UFO case, and he displayed a large photo of the UFO.
At one point, the object soars to 80,000 feet, hovers, then drops at supersonic speeds, coming to a full stop. How did it accomplish these feats?
The UFO in the photo was later reported to just be a blurry party balloon. The mainstream media reaction to this event was couched as cheeky celebrity news, rather than science or national defense. But that was all about to change. On the same day he resigned, members of TTSA had introduced Elizondo to UFO author and longtime UFO researcher Leslie Kean. She interviewed him and published 2 stories in the Huffington Post in mid-October, which revealed in a media exclusive the existence of the Pentagon UFO program and Elizondo's role in it. However, these 2 stories were still mostly ignored by the mainstream media. Leslie Kean then reached out to longtime associate and journalist Ralph Blumenthal. Blumenthal pitched the ATIP and Elizondo story to the New York Times. And on December 16, 2017, the New York Times and Politico released front-page bombshell news stories that revealed the Pentagon's ATIP UFO program to the world. Included in the stories were videos of UFOs filmed by the U.S. Navy. Within hours, dozens of other news agencies had the story. Within days, hundreds. The first domino had finally fallen.
There is very compelling evidence that we may not be alone, whatever that means.
Full speed ahead. Ain't gonna stop till we're all the way there. Full speed ahead.
But some people had doubts. They noticed that something was off, that some things were not adding up. One of those people was researcher John Greenwald, one of the nation's leading authorities on government secrets. He runs the Black Vault, a website that hosts millions of pages of government documents obtained via the Freedom of Information Act. When he read the December 2017 UFO stories, he immediately noticed some strange discrepancies.
Well, right off the bat, I noticed that the reporting from Brian Bender at Politico and Leslie Kean, Ralph Blumenthal, and Helene Cooper at New York Times had a slightly different program name. Politico says Advanced Aviation Threat Identification Program. New York Times reports Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. Why was there that difference? The amount of sources that both news media outlets had were very, very small and likely the same. So how is it that the reporting was different? As the reporting went on, it got worse. I mean, there were like 7 or 8. I lined them all up with dates and who the media outlet was. And there were like 7 different variations of what ATIP even stood for. And to an investigator or a researcher like myself, and there's a lot of other people out there, if you're looking into something, you need to have the name right. Because if you don't have the name right, how are you going to find anything?
Right, because when you submit a Freedom of Information Act request, you have to be specific with the government what you're asking for. So if you requested for the Advanced Aviation Threat Identification Program, they could come back and say, hey, that doesn't exist.
Absolutely.
Because the name was wrong.
Yep.
And you could suddenly be on a goose chase looking for the truth, for the real documents, correct?
Absolutely. The accuracy there was incredibly important.
The Pentagon officially acknowledging its Advanced Aviation Threat Identification Program.
Pentagon has confirmed the existence of the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program.
The Advanced Aerospace.
The Advanced Aerial Threat Identification Program.
So the writing was on the wall that there was something odd just behind the meaning of the acronym.
Another reported detail that is inconsistent was the years all this supposedly occurred. The original New York Times report said the program began in 2007. But further down the same article, they report the funding and actual contract creation of the program wasn't until late 2008.
You start digging in on that and realize that the bid solicitation was never posted for companies to bid on getting the contract, wasn't posted until 2008. Yet we were led to believe that ATIP started in 2007.
Created in 2007.
2007.
So how can you solicit bids a year after the program allegedly started when the reporting said $22 million went to a contractor that started a year before the bid went in? Wait, none of that makes sense.
Adding to the confusion, Politico's reporting released on the same day as the Times, with reportedly the same sources as the Times, says ATIP began in 2009. What? Now, in journalism, dates and names are so basic. You want to get the basic names right. You want to get the basic dates right. You can't be a year or two off. And to this day, the reported dates of the UFO program remain all over the place.
Generally, in reporting like that, if one thing is wrong, you have to ask the question, what else is wrong?
Further questions and issues arose with Lou Elizondo's role with ATIP. In hundreds of media reports, Elizondo is credited as the director of ATIP. Media outlets also phrased it as he ran the program, or he was in charge of the program. And Elizondo, without doubt, is the face of this whole story now. But the Pentagon has released statements stating Mr. Elizondo had no responsibilities with ATIP. And this is a statement the Pentagon has doubled down on, and they're not budging. And even now, over 4 years later, this central part of the whole story continues to be disputed. Another confusing detail is, at the very top of the original Times report is a video of a UFO filmed by the US Navy. The Times reports that ATIP investigated and released this now famous video to the public. Yet the video was shot in 2015. ATIP shut down in 2012. Also, the Department of Defense released a statement saying no, that video had not been cleared for public release. And some in the media wondered how much of this was simply a so-called sweetheart deal between Senator Reid and his longtime friend and financial supporter, Robert Bigelow. Back in 2017, there were a handful of journalists who pointed this out as a potential red flag.
Public records show Bigelow contributed about $20,000 to Reid and his Political Action Committee.
That campaign contributor got research contracts from this program. That just is a bad picture.
There are other outstanding questions, confusing statements, and blatant errors. But despite all this, the story, mostly as originally reported over 4 years ago, mostly without any corrections or updates or disclaimers, continues to spread like wildfire and has become legendary.
So what you're telling me is that UFOs are real?
Bill, I think we're beyond that already. I put my entire career on the line because I believe in what I believe in.
He ran the Pentagon's top secret UFO program.
I knew this was breaking news for the front page of the New York Times.
And then, bam, the New York Times story. It changed everything.
It was a bombshell, right? That's what it was.
This is too big to turn away from.
This is real. Wake up.
TMC investigates.
I don't know if I'm going to have a job tomorrow just for having this conversation with you.
UFOs, the Pentagon Proof, Tuesday at 8.
Then, in October of 2021, the plot twist. Remember that unknown and unnamed individual who was the first director of the ATIP UFO program? Well, we eventually learned his name, James Lakatsky. And after that, we learned his story. He's finally come out of the shadows to set the record straight. Lakatsky, along with Colm Kelleher, a project manager for the Pentagon program, and journalist George Knapp, released a book titled Skinwalkers at the Pentagon, an insider's account of the secret government UFO program. They say the story we've been told for over 4 years is wrong. Lakatsky's book says, since the December 2017 article in the New York Times, there has been a multi-year frenzy of speculation, misinformation, and confusion about the nature of the program. One of the purposes of this book is to correct the record. Co-author Colm Kelleher did an interview saying,
the New York Times article in December 2017 mistakenly used that acronym ATIP, and they mistakenly assigned Lou Elizondo to be head of this program. And that was a mistake in reporting by the New York Times.
They say many details in the original story were in error. And guess what? There's actually real documented evidence to back that up. And surprisingly, some of these documents have been out in the public domain for years now. It's just that many people, including myself, didn't fully understand what they were or how they related, if at all, to a Pentagon UFO program called ATIP. Probably because they don't mention anything about ATIP and they don't mention UFOs. They mention something else. So I now present to you the mostly untold and underreported story of the Pentagon's AAWSAP program. In 2008, at the behest of Senator Harry Reid, the Pentagon, through the Defense Intelligence Agency, created a program not called ATIP, but rather the Advanced Aerospace Weapons Systems Application Program, or AAWSAP. We know this because here's the actual official Pentagon document outlining AAWSAP, not ATIP. The director of AAWSAP was a Defense Intelligence Agency scientist named James Lakatsky. We know this because here is his name listed on official Pentagon documents as being in charge of the program. In many ways, AAWSAP started with James Lakatsky. According to both Lakatsky and Senator Reid, Lakatsky had approached the senator to say he believed the UFO phenomena was real, and he wanted a program to investigate not just UFOs, but also how UFOs might fit into the realm of what we might consider the paranormal. Reid told Lakatsky he would support the creation of a program, but, according to Reid, they faced a challenge: how to convince Congress to allocate taxpayer money to investigate UFOs. Could they create a UFO program without actually mentioning UFOs? Reid told New York Magazine, I said to Lakatsky, well, if you were me, what would you say to people in power in the United States Senate who have huge control over the spending of defense money? And here's what Lakatsky said. What I will do is prepare something for you that anyone can look at that wants to. And it's strictly science. He put it in scientific language, what the study should consist of. Here are the actual AAWSAP contract objectives. There are no mentions of UFOs at all. To anyone reading it, it might seem like just a normal aerospace technology contract. The actual objective of the program was essentially, using currently evolving technology trends, predict what kind of aerospace technologies foreign adversaries will have 40 years from now. That's basically it. AAWSAP appeared to be something normal, that the government would normally spend money on. AAWSAP was funded with $22 million. The Pentagon awarded the $22 million to Bigelow Aerospace Advanced Space Studies, or BASS. BASS was contracted to perform all of AAWSAP's technical research and analysis. We know this because here is an actual Pentagon document acknowledging BASS as the contract recipient. BASS was founded by millionaire and longtime Harry Reid financial supporter Robert Bigelow. Within the BASS team was Hal Puthoff, who we already briefly discussed, as well as other scientists with a history of unorthodox ideas, including Dr. Colm Kelleher and Dr. Eric Davis, an astrophysicist who's written papers discussing psychic teleportation, time travel through Stargate wormholes, and bending spoons with your mind. BASS hired a team of 50 people, and then the work on AAWSAP began. On the surface, AAWSAP appeared to be an aerospace technology program. To Harry Reid, in his words, AAWSAP was actually a program to study UFOs and related phenomena. With Bass, however, that so-called related phenomena would take AAWSAP in a shocking and very unexpected direction. A lot of AAWSAP's investigations took place at Skinwalker Ranch, a supposed paranormal hotspot in Utah owned by Robert Bigelow. As outlined in great detail, on the record, by Lakatsky and Bass leadership, the so-called Pentagon UFO program was not just a UFO program, but rather an investigation into a cornucopia of spooky and scary things, including werewolves, ghosts, and half-dinosaur, half-beaver monsters. Literally. The project manager of the program referred to Skinwalker Ranch as a paranormal Disneyland.
So the idea was to have a living laboratory on Skinwalker Ranch that we could assess what was going on. Unusual creatures, discarnate voices, poltergeist activity. So it was a paranormal Disneyland that really started the whole thing off.
AAWSAP spent only 1 year investigating UFOs, ghosts, and goblins before the Pentagon started to pull the plug. In 2009, after reviewing AAWSAP's reports, the Pentagon states that it was determined the reports were of limited value. In the December 2017 Politico article, a congressional staffer is quoted as saying, "There was really nothing there that we could justify using taxpayer money," and that even Harry Reid agreed it was not worth continuing. The Pentagon decided not to renew AAWSAP's funding and shut it down completely by 2012, stating that the program was terminated in 2012 due to lack of real progress and concerns about the viability of the program, and that it was determined that there were other higher priority issues that merited funding. James Lakatsky says he spent the next few years trying to get new funding to resurrect the dead program and to keep the paranormal investigations going, but he was unsuccessful. Finally, Lakatsky says he retired in 2016.
And that is the mostly untold story about how $22 million in taxpayer money was spent on a wacky paranormal funhouse. And it appears that at the time, the Pentagon had no idea this silly spooky stuff was even happening. How is that possible? Well, Lakatsky, the Pentagon director of the program, says that for security reasons, he was hiding AAWSAP's activities from officials at the Pentagon.
People in my own office, they didn't know what we were doing. They had no idea that I was running Skinwalker Ranch. They had no idea whatsoever.
And was Harry Reid aware of the ghosts and goblins? Well, I guess it depends on which version of his story you want to believe. In 2018, in an interview with New York Magazine, Reid denied ever being briefed or updated on any of AAWSAP's activities. Ever? But then in 2021, Reid told George Knapp that not only was he aware of AAWSAP's activities at Skinwalker Ranch, but that he was potentially planning to go to the ranch himself.
I remember getting a call from you while you're in the well of the Senate, and you asked about Skinwalker Ranch, whether your staffers should go there and whether they'd be safe. Did you consider sending some of your people to the ranch, and did you ever consider going there yourself?
I considered it, but based on information I got from you and others, I decided not to go.
It would also have drawn attention to the ranch and the program, right? If you went there, you'd have to tell somebody about it.
That's for sure.
And Senator Reid would eventually fully endorse this whole crazy story 2 months before his death by writing the foreword to Lakatsky's book. In it, he calls out the New York Times.
The December 2017 New York Times story has done a tremendous amount of good, but unfortunately, it has also muddied the waters. It left the government's AAWSAP program completely out of the narrative.
Yeah, why wasn't any of this stuff reported in that bombshell 2017 New York Times article? How did a story about a program called AAWSAP, which investigated UFOs, werewolves, ghosts, goblins, become a story about a program called AATIP, which only investigated UFOs?
Well, Leslie Kean is a longtime UFO believer and UFO researcher, writing UFO stories going back decades. She wrote a best-selling book on UFOs in 2010, and it was Leslie Kean who approached Ralph Blumenthal to pitch the big UFO story to the New York Times. She was one of the authors of the New York Times article.
In a recent Showtime documentary, Leslie Kean was asked why stories about alleged encounters with alien creatures were not included in her 2017 New York Times article. And she replied that her specific goal with that article was to give UFOs credibility, so she avoided reporting on some things.
I chose not to focus on it because the angle that I was taking in my reporting was to try to get credibility for the subject, and I knew that that was not the way to go. That was not the first step in terms of getting people to accept this.
So an author of the original New York Times article, the article that was the first domino to fall in all of this, says she wrote the article with a specific angle in mind: get people to accept UFOs as real. That sounds like the goal of an activist, not a journalist. But I see where she's coming from, because could you imagine if that first New York Times article had talked about werewolves and poltergeists and giant dino beavers? It would have been laughed at and ridiculed and used as a prime example of the government wasting taxpayer money. But because all of that wasn't mentioned, and only unidentified flying objects were, that New York Times article continues to validate UFOs with not just your average citizen, but also with members of Congress.
Since the New York Times story came out in December 2017, it's politically viable for elected officials to come forward and say, I support this kind of research. But that's for researching things in the sky that might be a threat to national security or to aviation safety. It's another matter for a politician to say, I agree with spending money to investigate places like Skinwalker Ranch with spooky stories of boogeymen and werewolves. No politician is going to fund poltergeist research or looking into werewolves. They'd be crucified.
So how much of the actual story did the original New York Times article report? How much of the actual story is currently influencing Congress?
The scope of the AAWSAP program was gigantic compared to the small sliver of information that was reported via the New York Times. And so the purpose of the book was really to set the record straight. I think the book really encapsulates about 97% of AAWSAP, whereas the 3% was what the New York Times article had described.
3%. According to those actually in charge of the actual program, the original New York Times article about the program only contains 3% of the actual story. 97% wasn't included. So let's talk about the 3% that was. It was originally reported that the name of the program was AATIP, and it was led by a guy named Lou Elizondo. So first, where the heck did the name AATIP come from? In his book, program director James Lakatsky writes, AATIP was a made-up, substitute name to describe AAWSAP. A made-up name? So he's saying that AATIP
didn't even exist, that AATIP itself was a nickname, and only a nickname, to the AAWSAP program. So they were the exact same thing. AATIP was just a nickname, AAWSAP being the program.
The program was nicknamed Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, AATIP. People have had trouble trying to get documents out of the Pentagon by saying they want all documents in AATIP, and they have a hard time because that wasn't actually the name of the program. The top name there as the actual name of the program, but ATIP was the nickname that it went by.
And even Harry Reid and the Pentagon have previously agreed with this. Reid stated in an interview that ATIP and AAWSAP should be considered together. When researcher Roger Glassell asked about the names ATIP and AAWSAP, a Pentagon spokeswoman replied that they were the same program, and that AAWSAP was just an alternative name for ATIP. So how did ATIP become a nickname for AAWSAP? Well, remember how Lakatsky said he was hiding AAWSAP from other officials at the Pentagon? How, according to Lakatsky, they had no idea whatsoever about AAWSAP's activities? In their book, the authors say Senator Reid and those working at Skinwalker Ranch were worried that AAWSAP's activities would eventually come to light. As such, Senator Reid submitted a request that AAWSAP be given top secret special access status, which, if approved, would have officially limited how many people had access and control over the program. Here is the special access request letter submitted by Senator Harry Reid to Deputy Secretary of Defense William Lynn in 2009. But instead of saying AAWSAP, the actual program name, Reid used the nickname ATIP. But Reid's plan to protect AAWSAP apparently backfired. His request was denied, and his letter was widely distributed within the Pentagon. The cat was out of the bag.
Suddenly, the rest of the Pentagon, which had no idea that this program was underway, they had no idea. Suddenly, everyone knows about it, and they start asking questions. Gosh, what if this gets out that we're involved in study of UFOs and ghosts and creatures?
So two things appear to have happened here. One, Reid's letter was the first time many within the Pentagon had even heard about this program, and Reid's letter used the nickname ATIP. So according to those who were previously in the dark about all this, ATIP was the name of the program. 2. The Pentagon didn't want this embarrassing story spreading outside the Pentagon. They didn't want it in the press, and they didn't want speeches in Congress about government waste. So they moved to shut it all down. The New Yorker quotes a Pentagon official saying, "People worried that if all this came out, that the government was spending money on this will be a bad story." The Pentagon pulled AAWSAP's funding in 2010, and by 2012, the funding had completely dried up, and AAWSAP was officially dead. But despite the program being shut down, Lou Elizondo, who had become interested in the UFO aspects of AAWSAP, claims he kept the effort going at the Pentagon. According to James Lakatsky, Elizondo adopted and appropriated the name ATIP to describe this new, small, unfunded, and unofficial effort. Lakatsky has only done a handful of interviews since going public. Here's a revelatory clip from one of them on the Coast to Coast radio show where he specifically addresses this.
The ATIP name was created for a letter that Senator Reid sent in trying to establish a DOD SAP for our program for various reasons. And Lou used that name when he, and I guess it had to be in the time frame of 2012, and he used the name ATIP. Nothing wrong with that. I mean, that's fine. But there was a difference between the two programs. Ours had $22 million in funding, his had zero. But he did his thing, we did ours. But I can say that we were the only game in town.
So what did Lou Elizondo actually do? You know, the guy who everyone refers to as the director of ATIP, the Pentagon UFO program?
Luis Elizondo, former director of the Pentagon's Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program.
Luis Elizondo ran the Advanced Aviation Threat Identification Program.
The man who ran that secret program, Luis Elizondo, thank you for joining us.
Was he even involved in the official Pentagon program at all? In the 221-page book about the Pentagon UFO program, Elizondo appears one time. That's a bit strange, right? One time. At a 2009 dinner, sitting at a table with members of AAWSAP and BASS, where the authors claim he was telling war stories about his psychic powers. That's it. Well, Elizondo himself has stated multiple times on the record that he had nothing to do with AAWSAP, including this emphatic tweet, which says, "It's been brought to my attention that despite my constant assertion in the media about my non-involvement in AAWSAP, some are under the false impression that I was part of it. For the record, again and again, I was not part of AAWSAP." Elizondo instead says he was in charge of the Pentagon's ATIP program, which I think we've established probably didn't even exist. Insiders say it was not an official program. It was a completely separate small initiative. A small unofficial effort. Not a program as the P in ATIP suggests, but more in his spare time, when his normal day job allowed, he looked for UFOs. There are two pieces of documentation that further supports this. One is an email from the year 2020, released via the Freedom of Information Act to John Greenwald. In it, Elizondo is challenging the Pentagon press office regarding their statements denying his role with ATIP. Elizondo concedes that his ATIP could be defined more as simply an activity versus an actual program. The second is an annual Pentagon evaluation of Elizondo from the year 2016. It outlines all his officially assigned responsibilities at the Pentagon, none of which have to do with UFOs, or anything called ATIP. So with all that in mind, let's look again at the Pentagon's official statement regarding Elizondo. That appears to be a true statement. In April 2022, Brian Bender, the author of the original 2017 Politico article, tweeted that he now feels like he was purposely misled by numerous sources on what ATIP really was and wasn't. In response to a Twitter user stating, "Seems clear that they wanted to gloss over the paranormal stuff, which is like where all the money really went," Bender replied, 100%. They buried the origin story because they were afraid it would be perceived as an utter waste of taxpayer money. It would have also further soured the whole effort, given the Bigelow connection to Harry Reid. It was a pork project to investigate voodoo that morphed into UFOs. And regarding myself and all the Basement Office episodes I've made about ATIP and Elizondo, I was apparently wrong. It wasn't intentional, but in an honest attempt to report the truth about the Pentagon UFO program, I too feel like I was purposely misled. As for Elizondo, he, along with other former members of Tom DeLonge's To the Stars Academy, have been lobbying Congress to spend more money on UFOs. They say the original New York Times article continues to influence congressional leaders, since many of the paranormal aspects weren't included in that story. Chris Mellon, the guy who once stood in front of a gigantic photo of a blurry party balloon, admits that telling Congress about AAWSAP would be counterproductive. Their efforts appear to have paid off. Bipartisan congressional leaders like Senators Kristen Gillibrand and Marco Rubio helped create a new UFO program at the Pentagon. The new program is called the Airborne Object Identification and Management Synchronization Group. And another domino falls. I'm gonna leave you with one more thing. Lou Elizondo said he had nothing to do with AAWSAP. Nothing to do with the werewolves and ghosts and goblins. Nothing to do with AAWSAP. However, in May 2021, Elizondo filed a complaint with the Department of Defense Inspector General's office. Written in his own words, signed with his signature, Elizondo's complaint accuses some at the Pentagon of smearing his reputation by releasing statements denying his involvement as director of ATIP. In his complaint, which I obtained a copy of, he outlines, in detail, each and every role he claims to have had from 2008
to 2017. In 2008, he says he joined James Lakatsky on AAWSAP. His role was, in his words, AAWSAP's Chief of Counterintelligence and Security. From 2008 to 2010, Elizondo describes his various duties with AAWSAP, including reviewing incoming reports from BAS. In April 2010, he writes, Dr. Lakatsky approached me and asked if I would consider assuming the role of AAWSAP and ATIP director. And in May 2010, he says his new role was director for ATIP and AAWSAP. I think we should stop and ask ourselves, how did we get here? What stories brought us here? Who told those stories? Are we closer to the truth, or are we further away? Perhaps to find the answer, instead of waiting for the next domino to drop, maybe there's only one thing left to do. A true story will stand the test of time. Change one thing, and it can look completely different, like something else altogether. If you went back and re-followed the evidence, would the story sound the same? Would it look the same? Would you see something different, something new, something that was always right there, right in front of you? You are here at the beginning. Over the next few episodes, we will go back to re-examine and reassess some of the most incredible UFO stories ever told. The only question is, where will this new journey take us? So, let's begin.